Welcome to Hot Topics in International Trade, brought to you by Braumiller Law Group and Braumiller Consulting Group. Hi, this is Bob Brewer with Braumiller Law Group. Welcome to the podcast. I know we've been gone for a little while, but we're back now. I'm back actually with Mama Bear, Adrienne Braumiller. As you know, in the past, we've chatted a lot about China in general, but one of the specifics that we talked about, which we want to cover again in today's podcast, is forced labor, for those of you. And I was really, at the time, I remember seeing at a conference, I can't remember where we were, Orlando or something like that, where you and George Tuttle had actually done an initial presentation. It was like a couple of years ago. Mm-hmm. And I'm sitting there listening to this, thinking to myself, there is no way on God's primarily blue planet that this is going to happen. It's almost like a mandate of don't do business with China anymore. Mm-hmm. But I'm finding out, a couple of years later, as we sit here, and I was thinking this was going to be all about China. It really isn't when you look at the stats.
Well, it is and it isn't. So there's a lot of transshipment. So essentially, when you look at the statistics, you'll see that Malaysia has more than $1 billion worth of shipments that have been detained. So it's significant. However, those are typically goods that have been transshipped from the Uyghur region.
Okay. For those of you who may not know exactly, explain a transshipment, how that actually works then.
Okay. So essentially what's happening is a company is trying to avoid the detection of the country of origin or the location of where the goods are actually being made. Mm-hmm. And so they ship goods to a third country to kind of shield or hide the origin of the goods. And so they'll try to say that the origin of the goods is Malaysian when in fact it's actually Chinese origin.
Gotcha.
Especially because customs is requiring zip codes be reported, and the zip codes that are related to the Uyghur Autonomous Region, of course, that's an immediate, ding.
Yeah.
And so, people are definitely more likely to try and transship as a result. And so Malaysia's the big country, the biggest country that has transshipment, and then followed by Vietnam.
Ooh, spread out, though. It looks like you pulled these stats up for me a couple of minutes ago.
Right.
I was really curious. It's at 1.8 billion. Yeah, and spread out, as you say, between Malaysia and. Mm-hmm. But when I look at this too, I wanted to see, was there a breakout of the WROs and the findings on these stats to date?
Not really, because no, and it gets confusing as a general proposition because you've got two different forced labor regimes working. You've got the forced labor law in general, where you have WROs for all countries where there's forced labor and findings, right, versus the UFLPA where it's a presumption.
Right.
And it's a detention based on that presumption. So it's different.
All right. Any kids out there not know the difference between a WRO and a finding? Real quick, give us an explanation.
The WRO is there is a reasonable suspicion that there was forced labor, that the goods were made with forced labor, whereas a finding is there's conclusive evidence that customs has found forced labor in the supply chain.
Wow.
So essentially what this is requiring is a year later, we're past a year since UFLPA was put into effect, we're finding continual need to trace the entire supply chain from, your first tier supplier back through the supplier.
How do you do that?
You can. You can. It's definitely more doable than it used to be.
All right.
There's a lot of pressure being put on companies to do this. And while the UFLPA is probably the strictest law globally, there's no other law in the in the world that's this significant and this difficult for traders. You're seeing that this is starting to permeate throughout the globe, right? So we've got the UK. They actually had an anti-slavery law put in place in 2015. It's not as tough as ours, but it may move that way. The EU's got a proposed legislation. I think it'll go that way.
You do? Okay.
You've got Canada. Their law, their forced labor law goes into effect on January 1st of 2024.
Okay.
But we also have, with Mexico and Canada, the USMCA provisions on preventing forced labor. So both of them were already in that treaty agreed
Okay.
hey, we're not going to allow forced labor. So let's take an example. If we have a good that's detained under the UFLPA in the U.S., can you ship that good? Can you export it, right? Because one of the things you can do the minute that it's detained is you can export it before 30 days is up.
Okay.
And so what does that really mean? You're exporting goods that customs thinks are made with forced labor to another market.
Yeah.
You're sending goods made with forced labor to another market. What market will take it? Okay. So we know, don't send it to the EU in the future. Don't send it to the UK now. Don't send it to Canada. You can't send it to Mexico, right? Australia. So you're going to see more and more other countries mirroring what we're doing, but they're not there yet.
Okay.
And so what do you do to kind of try to trace the supply chain? There are several tools out there. There's several softwares. It's all based on publicly available data.
Okay.
There's universities that are extremely good at what they do and identifying entities that use forced labor.
Okay.
So
this is the supplier to the supplier to the supplier that
yes.
this thing can go that deep and peel back the onion.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. What some companies are doing is they're taking a preemptive approach where they are already tracing a specific supply chain if it's particularly important to their livelihood.
Yeah.
And in case customs ever detains the goods, it's not going to be entry specific, but it's going to be supply chain specific.
Okay.
And so they're mapping that now so that they can prove to themselves and to customs, if it ever becomes an issue, that these goods are not made with forced labor.
Huh.
And so more and more, you're going to see more and more of that being done.
Well, adopting what the United States of America is doing.
Yeah.
Imagine that.
Adopting what the U.S. has done and adopting a supply chain transparent approach.
See, I thought that in the beginning that there was just no way that there was going to be a way to continue to do business with China. Quite frankly, we were getting a lot of calls on IMEXs.
Yes.
You know? I want to move I have to. It's not as easily.
And there's still a lot of, yes, and there are Chinese companies that have moved their factories to Mexico. They have. But again, the UFLPA focuses on any components that are made with forced labor. So if a Chinese company sends any components at all, you can't have 1%.
Well, we're talking about substantial transformation.
Yeah, but that doesn't matter.
No,
that doesn't matter. You could have a Mexico good made with forced labor, like if it has an incorporation of an item that had minimal forced labor. Again, UFLPA would prevent its entry. There's no de minimis amount that is permitted for UFLPA.
Okay.
And so the other thing to keep in mind is that Congress has been very focused on enforcement. And recently there was a letter. Let me get the specifics for you. There was a letter on September 19th to Secretary Blinken and Secretary Mayorkas asking for rigorous enforcement of the UFLPA.
Okay.
And they went into several entities that they would like to be added to the UFLPA entity list. And that list is, if you have a shipment that comes in from that entity, then of course there's a presumption of denial.
Okay.
Okay. So they've added a bunch of parties here that they want Homeland Security and Department of State to consider. And this was a letter that was sent by Mike Gallagher, who's the chairman of the House Select Committee on China.
Okay.
Yeah. And they want a lot more sanctions on China related to forced labor.
They do.
Yeah.
I mean, we're in so deep with. Let's go.
I know.
As we sit here, what is this? October 19th, 2023. The world is on fire.
I know.
It is on fire.
Yeah.
And here, we're sitting here. I know we're talking about forced labor. There's so many
other things
to think about at this point
that seem more concerning.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you could lose sleep over it, obviously.
Well, I know. Yeah.
And I'm thinking
with the wars that were.
Yeah, because as the world turns, so does international trade.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this goes without saying, and the way that I tell you what's going on in the South Pacific right now with China, and I don't know, Adrienne, are we on the verge of World War III? But
I'm an optimist, and I don't want to say yes.
is this forced labor kind of a moot point?
No, it's important. It's
It is.
important because it impacts everything,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
I mean, no one wants to buy goods made with child labor or forced labor.
Yeah.
I mean, I certainly don't. I don't want to, support any kind of industry that's involved with that. But it's very pervasive. The industries that are covered, it's primarily electronics, but then of course you've got textiles, you've got industrial equipment, and you've got metal, you've got agriculture. I mean, it's pretty much every industry, as long as it's made with minority labor that's being forced to do it.
Right.
And so there's a lot of that happening.
Oh, yeah.
And it's a problem because,
Well, it's
part of the
tied in-
guidance is, can you audit it? And you can't really.
Well, we
can't
talked
really,
about this. We
right.
talked about this in a past podcast.
Right.
I mean, the realistic situation of like, can you actually go to a factory in China and knock on the door, unannounced, and say, "We're here to videotape.
No.
You're all of your employees. We need the documents."
No.
It's just not going to happen.
No.
No way.
No.
No way. So anyhow, do you have any real world examples then of where we've bailed someone out on this at this juncture?
I think the majority of people are still, unless you've had a detention. And I mean, there have been a lot of detentions, but not nearly as many as I thought there would be.
Okay.
Right. So when you talk about, the total number of detentions is a little over 5,000, and you compare that to the number of imports, right? That's really not that many.
Yeah.
So the majority of our clients are more proactive than they are reactive. We haven't had many, issues with having reactive situations. Most people have been very proactive, because of CTPAT, the CTPAT requirement for forced labor review.
Right.
We're helping a lot of people do that supply chain review.
Yes, we are.
Of high risk companies, just making sure, like, hey, are any of our business partners high risk? If they are, we need to eradicate that risk, whatever that means.
Yeah.
Does it mean that we need to remove them from the supply chain? We will. And of course, the other thing that a lot of clients are doing is adding contractual provisions to help protect themselves in case they're somehow a victim to an unscrupulous supplier, right?
Gotcha.
So because that happens.
Okay.
There's fraud everywhere.
Yes, there is. So, what I want to do right now, I want to keep these to 15 minutes, as everyone out there knows is watching our podcasts. But, and you say, my peeps in the UK, where were you, Bob? Where were you? Well, I lost my other producer to the dispatch in Washington, D.C. Kudos. I think she's done a great job there too, Victoria. Good for you.
Yay.
Sheena's behind the camera now to help us out. So when we post these, we put them out there on Spotify, get them up there basically on the YouTube channel. Why don't you peeps who are interested, let us know. Adrienne will jump in on a variety of topics that you'd like us to cover. Okay. And definitely we'll take a look at that now that we're kind of back in the saddle on these. We can definitely cover a lot of things probably the next quarter.
Sure.
You have no problem with that. This is just a walk down the hallway for you,
Yes.
That's why we're here. All right. But I appreciate you stopping by.
Well, thank you.
All right. Thanks for listening, everybody.
Thank you.
See you later. Relax. We've got you covered. Global trade compliance to us is just another day at the beach.